Welcome to the lecture on the New Deal and the Great Depression. Your textbook reading gives you a number of factors behind the Great Depression. So one thing I want to add that's not in your textbook, but historians have started to explore recently, is the growing wealth disparity as one of the causes of the Depression. You can see in this slide a remarkable similarity between the concentration of wealth in the top 1% in 1929 and in 2008. And so why would the concentration of wealth at the top help spark economic downturns? Well, in an economy that depends on people buying lots of stuff, consumers need money to buy lots of stuff. Right? And so consumer economies generally thrive when there's a large, thriving middle class. And the problem with so much wealth concentrated at the top in a consumer economy is that the top 1% only spends a fraction of their wealth, right? Whereas a person making $60,000 a year might put $55,000 of that money back into the economy during that year. A person making $5 million a year might only spend a fraction of that yearly income. Right. So let's turn and take a look at the early responses to the Great Depression. The popular story of this period is that Herbert Hoover is really the villain of the Great Depression. Right, the story often goes that Hoover, sticking to his political ideology of small government and his trust that markets will simply work themselves out, did absolutely nothing. And it was FDR who had to swoop in and save the day with a New Deal. And so before we get into the New Deal itself, I want to challenge this image of Hoover as a do-nothing president. And I'm going to show you how his political ideology certainly limited his response, but he does go farther than other presidents before him in providing government solutions to a faltering economy. And so one of the problems in challenging the common perceptions of Hoover is that it's just so easy to paint Hoover as out of touch, right? As someone who has such a great faith in free markets that he won't use government intervention to fix market problems. And so just take a look at what he says when he accepts the Republican nomination for president in August 1928. He says, "We in America today are nearer the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We have not yet reached the goal, but given a chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation." And certainly this is an unfortunate time to make a statement like that just a year before the worst economic depression in American history. But Hoover didn't understand what was coming, right? Neither did almost any other business leader in the United States. And so when the Depression finally hit, Hoover relied on what had become the common response of the federal government to economic problems. First, he turned to the business community to solve the problems of the marketplace. This is a period when business leaders were used to having a prominent place in politics. When there was a problem, the president would create a task force of business leaders to provide solutions. And importantly, all of the solutions they suggested would be voluntary, right? If other business leaders didn't want to adopt these recommendations, they didn't have to. Another common solution for the 1920s is a call upon state and local governments to provide solutions. So Hoover asks states to provide jobs by investing in public projects. But this is also where Hoover departs from some of his predecessors. Rather than relying solely on state and local governments to provide public jobs, by 1932, towards the end of his first administration, he secured an unprecedented increase in federal spending for public works to the tune of $423 million. Using federal funds to employ people to work on federal public works projects is certainly a radical solution for his presidency for an economic depression. The most radical of all the solutions for Hoover, though, is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was approved by Congress in January 1932. And the purpose of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was to stimulate economic activity by providing federal loans to railroads, banks, and other businesses. And this should sound familiar to you if you were following the 2008 recession, where the federal government provided bailouts to what officials thought were vital industries. It's become a common response of the federal government to serious economic recessions. But in 1932, this is a radical, unprecedented move by a president. But the problem is that by the end of 1932, the corporation loaned out only 20% of its $1.5 billion in funds. Still, where Hoover was willing to take unprecedented steps in intervening into the economy, he would refuse to deliver direct federal relief for unemployed Americans, arguing that the American way required private charity, not federal government, to handle direct aid. And this will be one of the major differences between Hoover's response and FDR's response. And so FDR, as we get into the election of 1932, was governor of New York. In the early years of the Depression. He's preparing to run against Hoover in the presidential election. And so the question is, what do you think he is saying publicly about Hoover, right? What sort of policies do you think he is implementing as governor? And given that what FDR will eventually do as president, you might think that FDR is at this time criticizing Hoover for doing nothing. But actually, as governor, as late as 1930, he's condemning Hoover's limited recovery policies as far too radical, as contrary to the supply and demand. And in the case of public works, too big of a drain on the federal treasury. As governor, he slowly adopted policies of relief aid, but he still lagged behind President Hoover. Roosevelt slowly increased public works. He set up a temporary emergency relief administration, which distributed $25 million and provided relief for 10% of families in the state. So when he finally started a run against Hoover in 1932, though, it's only then that he starts to criticize Hoover for doing not enough, for not doing enough. And he begins to promise much more dramatic action than Hoover was promising. And as we get into the New Deal, as a side note here, I'm going to talk a lot about politicians and government reforms that they implemented to address the Great Depression. But it's important to note that the New Deal that FDR comes up with and implements is not simply the work of politicians rethinking the role of the state. The New Deal comes out of grassroots demands for a new relationship between the state and the economy, and new definitions of citizenship which entitled Americans to protections from economic downturns. Again, think about why this would make sense to workers. In a new global economy where recessions in Europe, the choices of stockholders, the poor management of money by banks could bankrupt the average worker or send families out on the street and put people on trains looking for work, when the poor management of land by people in other states could send dust clouds that ruin your crops, you could see why the ideal of individualism might make less sense to people living in the 1930s. And just one example of grassroots demands for the government to provide direct relief is the Bonus Army in 1932, while Herbert Hoover was still in office. More than 15,000 unemployed workers and their families organized at the Capitol as Congress debated a bill that would pay out World War I veteran bonuses early to help those veterans deal with the Great Depression. And those bonuses weren't scheduled to be paid out until 1945. So this group set up a Hooverville across the river from the Capitol in D.C. When Congress voted the bill down, several thousand bonus marchers stayed and continued to press their cause. Hoover sent in the U.S. Army with 4 infantry companies, 4 troops of cavalry, a machine gun squadron, and 6 tanks. And so it's at this time, within this kind of grassroots uprising, right, many Americans begin to look to unions to help put pressure on businesses and the government to respond to the consequences of the Depression. What we see during this moment is union membership increasing from 3.6 million in 1929 to 7 million in mid-1983. So when FDR wins the election of 1932, becomes president, he's not just trying to figure out what the government can do to address the economic depression, but also what the government can do in the short term for people who are unemployed and protesting. And so let's think about what makes the New Deal different from Hoover's solutions, just to organize all this information for us a bit better. So I want us to think about what makes the New Deal different from Hoover's solutions in three ways. One, the scale of the New Deal's intervention into the market, the federal protections for unions, and the New Deal's direct aid to individuals. And so I asked you in the reading to look at many of the key pieces of New Deal legislation. And I want to pick out 3 or 4 of the most important that will give you a sense of the differences between Hoover and Roosevelt. So let's start with an example that shows the scale of the New Deal's intervention into the market versus Hoover's policies. The Emergency Relief Appropriation Act allocated $4.8 billion for work relief programs. That's in comparison to Hoover's largest program, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which appropriated $1.5 billion and in the end only loaned out about 20% of that. Right, let's look at an example of how the New Deal created a new relationship between the state and unions. We spent a fair amount of time discussing the precarious position of labor unions in the U.S. in your readings. Right, they face state repression. Progressives were a bit more tolerant, but were trying to figure out a solution to class conflict, in part because progressives generally didn't like unions. The New Deal, really for the first time, provides federal protection for labor unions. The most important part of the National Industrial Recovery Act is Section 7A, which gave workers the right to organize unions. And when that law was eventually struck down by the Supreme Court, the Wagner Act then reaffirmed the right of workers to form unions, and it also outlawed many of the practices that made it difficult for unions to organize, including the practice of blacklisting employees who were involved in union organizing. And finally, let's look at an example of direct relief, which Hoover was unwilling to consider. More than any other piece of legislation, the Social Security Act provides the foundations of the welfare state in the U.S. What is still the most popular part of this bill is the federal pension system, where eligible workers pay mandatory Social Security taxes on their wages, and employers pay an equivalent amount. And so in return, workers received federal retirement benefits. This bill also set up a cooperative system between the federal government and states to provide unemployment insurance. Right? And finally, the most controversial part of the bill provided money for children living in low-income families without a father present. And so when I ended the Progressive Era lecture, I mentioned that we would get to the origins of modern liberalism in the 1930s. Right? And Franklin Roosevelt was responsible for changing the meaning of the word liberal. And so before we get into that, it's important to ask why he didn't simply call himself a progressive. After all, many of the economic regulations that he called for seemed to be in the spirit of progressive era reform. But by the 1930s, that moral and social control reform of the progressive era that we talked about, it really cast a dark shadow over the label progressivism. And FDR wanted to distance himself from his agenda from that legacy of moral reform. I mean, of all, Prohibition represented the most visible and unpopular legacy of progressive moral reform. The 18th Amendment was the first constitutional amendment to take away, rather than safeguard liberty. And it was fresh on the minds of voters as it lasted from January 1920 to 1933. And it's a reminder that even though we see the 1920s through this sort of return to normalcy framework, the return to a smaller federal government, that's only true when we think about the federal government's role in controlling the power of corporations. In other areas, the federal and state governments greatly expanded their power in the 1920s. Right? Prohibition led to the nation's first war on drugs, which led to a spike in the number of federal and state prisoners. In Virginia alone, 147,683 people were arrested for violating alcohol prohibition. Right? Prohibition also created financial incentives for harsh enforcement, since law enforcement could seize people's property, right, their vehicles. Virginia made $8 million when adjusted for inflation just in 1928 alone. Harsh penalties for possession, such as the Dean Act in Texas, set penalties for possession of liquor at 1 to 5 years. Look at the federal government expanded the power for law enforcement to spy on American citizens in order to investigate prohibition cases, as the Supreme Court ruled that wiretapping was constitutional. And so in the end, the population of federal prison inmates tripled between 1920 and 1930, from 3,720 to 11,400, forcing the federal government to build more federal prisons. So the prohibition was really a glaring symbol in the 1920s of the federal government's growing power. And FDR certainly was not concerned about moral reform. He was interested in using public policy to increase individuals' economic security. And so for this reason, FDR didn't have much of a political philosophy early in the New Deal because he wanted to distance himself from progressivism. Right? When a reporter asked him about his political philosophy, he responded, Philosophy, I'm a Christian and a Democrat, that is all. But by 1936, he starts to articulate a political philosophy by appropriating the word liberal. As FDR admitted, liberals of an older time who had in 1776, quote, sought freedom from tyranny of a political autocracy from 18th century royalists who held special privileges to the crown, end quote. Right? I mean, this is where he's referring to that liberalism of John Locke and Rousseau that we talked about. But FDR said that the New Deal liberalism would instead provide economic freedom from the economic royalists who had created a new despotism, these are his words, and wrapped it in the robes of legal sanction. And he continues, a small group had concentrated into their own hands complete control over other people's money, other people's labor, other people's lives. For too many of us, life was no longer free, liberty no longer real. Men could no longer follow the pursuit of happiness. For him, right, the new liberalism demanded not freedom from political tyranny, but what he called freedom against economic tyranny. And so this is how he kind of takes the meaning of liberalism and completely flips it on its head. And so we often focus on the New Deal and forget that it did receive resistance from powerful groups in the United States. Just as the 1930s saw the rise of modern liberalism, it also witnesses the rise of modern conservatism in opposition to the New Deal. These conservatives were people who had, up until the New Deal, thought of themselves as liberals because the word liberal had meant something completely different until, as I just mentioned, FDR completely changed its meaning. And so one person who would become one of the most important conservatives in the 1930s was Robert Taft, the son of the former president. And he's especially mad at this point that FDR is calling himself a liberal. Taft said, quote, the president has sought to appropriate to the New Deal all the ideas of liberalism. For Taft, liberalism was a political philosophy that championed individual liberty, not the government's role to secure economic security for all Americans. He thought that the government should give broad freedom to individuals, whether worker or employer, to pursue their economic interests so they might become more prosperous if they were able to take advantage of free market opportunities. Right? Taft did not believe that individuals' right to pursue economic opportunity should be understood to mean that the government had the duty to assure that everyone was treated equally in the job market. Herbert Hoover is also furious at FDR for using the word liberal. He becomes an opponent of the New Deal, and he says this, quote, true liberal government is founded on the emancipation of men. The prime purpose of liberal government is to enlarge and not destroy these freedoms. It was for the purpose that the Constitution of the United States was enacted. For that reason, we demand that the safeguards of freedom shall be upheld. It is for that reason that we demand that this country should turn its direction from a system of personal centralized government ideals of liberty, end quote. And so the problem for Hoover and Taft is that FDR had really won the battle over the meaning of liberal by the end of the 1930s. So they have to figure out what to call themselves if they aren't liberals anymore. And Taft finally settles on a word that we still use today. He starts to call himself a conservative. And so the most powerful conservative organization in the 1930s devoted to challenging the New Deal was the American Liberty League. And so in July 1934, the DuPonts, which was one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the United States, gathered a group of their business friends for a series of meetings in New York City at such locales as the Empire State Building, offices of disaffected Democratic politicians like the former New York State Governor Al Smith, and General Motors in Columbus Circle. And one of the DuPonts said that the main topic of the discussion was creating a, quote, property holders association to disseminate information as to the dangers to investors posed by the New Deal. But the group decided that the name of the association should not refer directly to property. It would be better to frame their activities as a broad defense of the Constitution. Right? They thought it should speak to the rule of law, not to the rights of the rich. And so its officers, they thought, should be drawn nationally from people in public positions who they thought were above reproach not from the leaders of industry and finance that people often despised. And the DuPonts hoped that it would be able to make an alliance with other organizations that, in their view, defended the Constitution, such as the American Legion, and even the Ku Klux Klan. And so each participant in these early meetings took a list of names of executives to call to discuss the idea, and in August the group incorporated itself as the American Liberty League. And one thing the Liberty League wanted to do was to rectify what its members perceived as the most serious problem, that business leaders did not have a prominent voice at the political bargaining table. Under the New Deal, the Liberty League argued, quote, business which bears the responsibility for the paychecks of private employment has little voice in government, end quote. This was something new and very concerning to business leaders. They had become used to having the ear of the president, especially in the 1920s. Remember, President Calvin Coolidge said that the business of America is business. And FDR didn't ignore business leaders, but it was clear that in the 1930s, the most prominent capitalists had far less power over public policy than in past decades. And so Liberty League members were also furious with how some New Dealers portrayed business leaders as the villains, right, who were responsible for the Depression. One of the Liberty League pamphlets noted that, quote, businessmen are denounced officially as organized greed, unscrupulous money changers who gang up on the liberties of the people. The dragon teeth of class warfare are being sown with a vengeance, end quote. By 1936, this organization enrolls 150,000 members, spent more than $1 million trying to defeat Roosevelt, and distributed millions of anti-New Deal pamphlets. And at its peak, the American Liberty League had 3 times as many staff members as the entire Republican Party. And despite all of this money that they mobilized, they were not able to defeat Roosevelt. And so the truth is that conservatism as a political ideology was really in the minority in the 1930s. And when you're in the political minority in the United States, one of the methods that you use to fight back is that you use the courts to challenge the constitutional merits of laws. And that's what happens in the 1930s. Conservatives didn't have the power to stop the New Deal in the political arena, but they did have some success in the courts, striking down New Deal legislation as constitutional. And a good term to understand the dominant ideology of the Supreme Court at this time is the term called judicial neoconservatism, which means that they're skeptical of government intervention into the economy, but support increasing the government's power in fighting crime and dissent, even when violating civil liberties. Remember the court case that I just talked about saying it's perfectly constitutional to wiretap people's phones. And I've noted a couple of important cases on this slide that struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act and another that struck down parts of the National Industrial Recovery Act. Right? These are the big victories of conservatives during this period. And so over the final weeks of this course, what we'll do is we'll start to watch modern liberalism and modern conservatism evolve.